First thing I would just say is, why do we work in the state capital in California? And the reason why we have for the last 20 years worked within the state capital is because we're very lucky in California in that we have a very progressive state legislature and a public that is very supportive of environmental priorities. And because of that, we have really established a proven track record of success for wildlife conservation. Over the last 20 years, Defenders of Wildlife has led the effort to remove lead ammunition in hunting for the benefit of condors and other raptors that feed on dead animals that are shot by lead ammunition or shot by ammunition. We have been deeply involved in numerous conservation planning bills, including the revision of the Natural Communities Conservation Planning Act, which is a very important bill that is widely taken advantage of within many areas, including a lot in Southern California, but also here in Sacramento. We've also been deeply involved in funding for conservation, working on bonds that have been put on the ballot over the years. And most recently, we were one of the leading organizations that basically culminated in about 10 years of work to get a significant increase in funding for our Department of Fish and Wildlife, adding 130 new staff people to the Department of Fish and Wildlife last year, which is enormous when you think about how underfunded that agency has been. An example is that before the staff was added, we had literally one staff person in working on the California Endangered Species Act, and now we have 30, or hopefully they're filling the jobs for at least 30 people. So California is essentially, I think, an incubator of great ideas and how to accomplish conservation. I think right now we're watching the effort to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030 play out in California. California is the first state to adopt that very important goal and is well ahead of the federal government in terms of implementing that goal with soon the release of their final strategy. But here I'm going to talk to you about, how a bill becomes a law. And it's from this, what do you call it, pathway. I'm going to just give you sort of the high points. And please feel free to put questions in the chat because I'm sure I'm not going to cover everything. But the first step in a bill becoming a law is the bill has to be introduced. So we're actually well into the bill session right now. Here we are in the mid-March, the latter part of March. Bills are introduced in January and February of a 2-year session. We are actually in the second year of a 2-year session. So we had bills that were introduced last year that have gone through the process, and some of them are still outstanding. I'll explain how a bill can become a 2-year bill. But then we also have a lot of bills that were introduced this year that are now making their way through the process. So after a bill is introduced by a member of the legislature, they either introduce, the assembly members introduce their bills in the assembly, and the senators introduce their bills in the Senate. They are then assigned by the Rules Committee to a policy committee. So the policy committees are the committees that are the ones that are experts on those particular issues for which the bill is dealing with. Sometimes bills will only go through one policy committee. Sometimes they can go through up to 3 policy committees. After a bill makes its way through the policy committee process, and during the policy committee process, we put letters in either supporting a bill, opposing a bill, saying we'll support a bill if it's amended to improve it, or that we'll oppose a bill unless it's amended to improve it. And so these are the various positions that you can take on a bill. And when the bill is presented in hearing, usually 2 witnesses give very brief testimony, and then the rest of us either get up and we say our name and who we're representing, and we support or oppose it. And then the bill is voted on. After it goes through policy committee, it then goes into, if the bill is going to cost money, it'll go into an appropriations committee. And then if it makes it out of the appropriations committee, it'll go to the floor of the first house for a vote. And if it makes it off the floor of the vote, it'll then get passed into the next house. So if an assembly bill goes through the assembly, makes it all the way through the assembly, it'll get referred to the Senate, and then it'll go through the same process on the Senate side. And then if it makes it through all of that, it'll get passed to the governor. And you'll note that it can either go straight to the governor or it can go back to the original house. It'll go back to the original house for a vote if the bill has been substantively changed in the second house. So if you've got a bill and you make a bunch of amendments to it, the second house will need to vote on it. Sometimes it'll pull that bill back into a policy committee hearing. Sometimes it'll just go straight to the floor of the original house for a vote. And then it'll go to the governor. And then the governor has time to either, the governor can do three things. The governor can either actively sign a bill, the governor can then veto a bill, or the governor can do nothing. If the governor does nothing, the bill will become a law. But usually the governor takes action rather than doing nothing. So the committees that we work with the most on the assembly side is the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee. Right now that is chaired, newly chaired now by Assembly Member Rebecca Bauer-Cahan from the Bay Area. And that is, like it says, Water Parks and Wildlife. So a lot of the bills we work on go through that committee. There's also the Assembly Natural Resources Committee that is chaired by Luz Rivas, who is from Southern California. And that committee handles the California Environmental Quality Act. It handles climate change issues, forestry issues. And so that's the difference between Water Parks and Wildlife and Natural Resources. And then for budget, which we didn't really talk about, but a big part of the work that we do is involving the budget. The governor introduces a budget in January, usually around January 10th. That is the governor's proposal for how he plans on spending money for the following fiscal year, which actually starts July 1st of the year in which the budget's introduced. So the governor introduced the budget this year, and it'll get enacted by June 30th, and then we'll start spending the money July of 2022 until January 30th of 2023. So when the governor introduces a budget, the budgets are then heard by various budget subcommittees that have expertise on various issues. So the Assembly Budget Subcommittee 3 is the subcommittee that hears all the budgets involving the Natural Resources Agency and all of its various departments, the California Environmental Protection Agency and all of its various departments, and transportation. So we spent a lot of time in front of that committee. On the Senate side, we have the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee that is chaired by Senator Stern from Los Angeles. And we have the Senate Environmental Quality Committee, which is very similar to the Assembly Natural Resources Committee in terms of what topics it covers. And that Senate committee is chaired by Senator Bob Wachowski, also from the Bay Area. And then we have the Senate Budget Subcommittee 2, which is the Senate counterpart of the Assembly Budget Subcommittee 3. And I forgot to mention, Assemblymember Bloom chairs a Budget Subcommittee 3, and Senator Stern, am I remembering that correctly? Now I'm having a senior moment. Is it Stern? No, it's Wachowski. Wachowski chairs the subcommittee 2. Senator Stern also sits on that subcommittee, along with Senator Laird from the Santa Cruz area. So those committees are the ones we work with the most. However, there are a lot of other committees that are out there, and we actually do end up in front of those committees. It could be judiciary, it could be transportation, it could be environmental safety and toxics. There's all different committees of jurisdiction in the legislature. Some of the legislative champions that I want to just highlight, and I've already mentioned some of them already, but these are folks that we tend to work with the most. They're the ones that tend to prioritize the kind of natural resource issues that we work on. So on the Senate, we have Mr. Ben Allen from the Santa Monica area, John Laird, who was formerly the resources, oops, someone's hijacking my slides.
Oh no.
There we go. All right. So John Laird, who was formerly the California Natural Resources Secretary under Jerry Brown. He's now the senator from the Monterey Central Coast area. We have Senator Monique Limon. She was formerly an assembly member. She now represents Santa Barbara and Ventura. She's amazing. We've got Henry Stern from coastal LA Ventura. And we have Senator Bob Wykowski from Santa Clara, Alameda area. He's again chairing both environmental quality and the appropriate budget committee. On the assembly side, I've already mentioned Assembly Member Bloom, who has been a big champion of wildlife issues. We have Assembly Member Laura Friedman, also from Los Angeles. She formerly chaired the the Natural Resources Committee. She now chairs the Transportation Committee, and she's actually carrying a very important bill on wildlife crossings and corridors this year. We have Eduardo Garcia, who represents the Imperial and Coachella Valley area. We've worked extensively with him on the Salton Sea, and he formerly was chairing the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee. He's now chairing the Energy Committee. Ash Kalra from San Jose. He was the one who carried AB 3030 last year, which was the legislature's effort to codify the goal of 30 by 30. He's now carrying a bill to ensure that equity is a component of 30 by 30. Mr. Kalra is also a big champion, and we like working with him a lot. We have Robert Rivas from Salinas, who has been a big champion on climate change issues, and also has been very supportive of 30 by 30. We have Mark Stone from the Santa Cruz, Monterey area. And then Assembly Member James Ramos, who's the only Native American currently in the legislature. And he actually was the author of one of the bills we passed last year, Assembly Bill 1183, that created the Desert Conservation Program within the Wildlife Conservation Board. And he's a big champion of desert conservation, as well as obviously a champion of tribal interests. So really quickly, we go through the legislative calendar. I talked to you about how the process of the bill, these are the sort of the dates. They shift every year, but generally speaking, this is kind of the form we follow. January, most bills take effect unless so bills that were passed in 2021, they would take effect this year, January 1st, 2022, unless it's an urgency bill. If it's an urgency bill, then it takes effect the moment the governor signs the bill. An urgency bill has to be passed by 2/3 of the legislature, or it's a budget bill, which also has to be passed by 2/3 of the legislature, and budget bills take effect July 1st. February 18th this year was the last day for new bills to be introduced. March and April, we're in the thick of the first policy committee hearings. In fact, today, there were literally 3 policy committee hearings that were going on at 9 o'clock this morning that we were trying to cover. We had Water Parks and Wildlife on the Assembly side, we had Senate Natural Resources Committee, and then we had Senate Transportation. April 30th is our last day for the policy committee to pass fiscal bills. These are the bills that actually cost money. So policy committee has to get their bills out of committee by April 30th, because those bills then have to go to appropriations. So they're on a little faster timeline. Whereas non-fiscal bills that don't have to go to the appropriations committee, those need to be passed by May 7th. May 21st is the big day when you find out whether your bills make it out of appropriations. Generally speaking, most of those bills kind of go out on the same day. And it's kind of crazy to watch the appropriations process when they literally just read through sometimes hundreds of bills in one sitting. June 4th is the last day for the House of Origin. So if you have an assembly bill, it needs to get out June 4th out of the Assembly. And if you have a Senate bill, it needs to get out of the Senate by that day. And then June 15th, as I already mentioned, is the last day for the legislature to pass the state budget, so that the governor then has time to review and sign the budget in order for it to go into effect July 1, so everyone can get paid and the money can continue to flow through the state budget. And then we go into the latter half, second House session. So then we have a flurry of policy committee hearings now that your bill has made it out of the first House in June and July. And then we have the same sort of deadline. Policy committees need to get their bills out by July 14th. And then, and that's a Friday. And then the following Monday, the legislature takes a month-long break, which we all enjoy, the peace and quiet of 1 month of them being gone. But usually it's actually not that quiet, because you're usually trying to work through any issues that are involved in your bills. And then you have, they come back, and 9 days or 11 days later, you got to get your bills out of the Appropriations Committee and onto the floor for second house. And then you have a very brief window to get all of the bills voted on in the second house, and you got to get them passed by September 10th. If your bill does not pass by September 10th, at the end of a 2-year session, your bill is dead. And then you have 1 month for the governor to sign or veto bills. And then again, bills take effect January the following year. So that's the whirlwind calendar. I would note California is different than a lot of states. Most states have very abbreviated schedules. We're more like the federal government in the sense of we have a basically all year long legislature. So the folks that work, your legislators work full time for you. Sometimes in other states, they have other jobs because they're only in maybe every other year or during a very brief period of time in a year, but not in California. It's a full-time gig. So the most important thing, how to get involved. The first thing I would just note is that you can research where your legislator is from. And I'll put into the chat, there is a find your legislature, legislator.ca.gov. And again, after I'm done chatting, I'll put it into the chat for you. And you can type in your address and it'll tell you who your assembly member is and who your state senator is. And believe it or not, it is really important for your constituents, for constituents to contact their legislator. I'm going to go back really quick before we move on. So you can write your legislator, you can call your legislator, you can meet with your legislator, and you can communicate them via the newspaper by writing letters to the editor or even opinion pieces. Defenders of Wildlife is very lucky in that we have people like myself who are involved in the state legislature representing the interests of the members and the organization, and other groups do too. However, paid lobbyists or representatives do not have the same effect as a member from the person's district. So if you're a senator or an assembly member and you're hearing from your district, you pay far closer attention to what those folks are saying than say for what I'm saying. So it's really important to have members contact and speak to their legislators directly. Your voice actually matters a lot. So I would strongly urge, and this is why Wildlife Advocacy Day is so important, but to reach out and communicate with your member directly. Those things are taken into account. So when is it most important to get involved? Well, obviously, if bills are being heard in committees, it's important to contact your elected official who's sitting in that committee. Before bills are voted on the floor, that's a key time to let your member know that it's important that they vote for or against that particular bill. And if you're not entirely sure, any time is important to contact your member. Over communication is better than no communication. And now I'm going to turn it over to Monica to talk about Wildlife Advocacy Day, because this is your opportunity to engage with the legislature in a very organized and efficient way. So Monica.
Thank you, Kim. And the first question we have here is, how does Defenders of Wildlife figure out which bills to support each session? So I will open that up for Kim.
So we go through the long list of bills. There are thousands of bills that are introduced every year. And we wade through the long list of bills, and we look and see what are they doing, what are they proposing, how do they intersect with our priorities. And then I present the list to Pam as the California director, and we talk about what are the most important bills. The other thing is if we're sponsoring a bill, obviously that's really important for us because we're literally the ones putting forward the bill idea and helping the legislator get the bill across the finish line. But for other bills that we're not sponsoring, it really just depends on, is it going to have a beneficial impact for wildlife? Is it going to have a detrimental impact to wildlife? And then we just sort of decide, based on how workload, how the likelihood of the bill passing or not passing, would we be able to actually get it over the finish line? Is it worth the investment of the time? And it's kind of a little more art than science, but we end up usually working on a number of bills, over the course of the year. And we, again, try to be value added. So I don't know, Pam wants to add to that.
Sure. Kim, thank you for that. And, I think your point about it being more art than science is so true. In addition to bills that directly impact wildlife, which is probably the easiest for us to decide on, there are also habitat impacts, which are obviously very important to wildlife. And then other issues that we work on, including water and wetlands and renewable energy, offshore wind. There was a big bill last year on offshore wind. And so we have to kind of do that calculus around how these legislative initiatives are being presented and how they intersect with our work and our priorities, our focal landscapes, our species. And, as I mentioned, we have a very small team right now, but we're covering a lot of issues statewide. And, California is very complex, and it can be kind of challenging. As Kim also mentioned, there are thousands of bills. This year we have whittled it down to about 123 bills that we're tracking right now, which is a lot to juggle. So thank God we have Kim as our contract lobbyist and amazing consultant, and Brain Trust as our founding director, who worked for us for almost 20 years. So it really is a matter of prioritizing, making sure that some bills that might be slipping under the radar that I don't recall if you talked about the spot bills, Kim, but sometimes there are bills that are just kind of placeholder bills that might deal with transportation, say, just randomly. But then they're what's called gutted and amended. They take all of the language out and they completely change the bill. What might be a transportation bill might actually end up being a bill about falconry or about wild pigs or something that is actually more aligned with our priorities. And so we really have to watchdog those bills as well as the bills that are very clearly articulated and spelled out and are the original purpose of the bill that was introduced. So there's a lot of moving parts. And as Kim noted on the schedule, we're constantly dealing with committee hearings and floor votes and everything, and then keeping an eye on spot bills and how they change and evolve throughout the 2-year process. So hopefully that answers the question, but I would welcome a follow-up if there is one.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those were great answers. And yeah, as Kim noted, feel free to follow up if you do have more to ask about that. Something I think that this question that was sent is pretty related to this because Kim mentioned sometimes defenders would sponsor a bill. And so this question is, what is the difference between a bill author and a bill sponsor? So what's that distinction?
So a bill author is the legislator themselves. So they are the author of the bill. A bill sponsor is an organization or an individual who comes forward with the bill idea and presents it to the bill author. And then the assembly or senator says, yeah, I want to do this bill. I'm going to author it for you. And then you work with that bill author to get the bill through the policy committee hearings, through whatever hearings you need, the floor, et cetera. You provide all the support, technical, policy, advocacy support in order to get that bill and that bill idea to the governor and signed. And so that's the difference between a sponsor and a supporter. So we support a lot of bills, but if we're not sponsoring the bill, then we're not directly responsible for that bill itself. Some bills are sponsored. There are a number of bills in the state legislature where the assembly member, the senator comes up with the idea on their own, and they are the author without a sponsor, which then means they can make whatever changes they want. Whereas if you have a bill sponsor, the author needs to work with the sponsors usually. That's the usual process where they want to try to work together to try to get that idea over the finish line. But ultimately, the legislator has the final say on what goes in a bill or not a bill that they are authoring.
Great, thank you so much. And I saw a couple of questions that I think we kind of answered. So just want to acknowledge that I did see a few questions in the chat that I think were answered in that first response. And so the last question I have here is, do legislators have a preference between all those different types of advocacy that were mentioned, you know, between in district versus capital meetings? Do they have a preference between calls, letters, or scheduled meetings? What's their preference?
Sometimes it depends on the member themselves. And the funny thing about the district meeting versus a Sacramento meeting, or in their legislative office in Sacramento, it's kind of weird right now because of COVID-19. And so almost all of the meetings that we have are via Zoom. So you have no idea where the member is when they're taking the meeting. But I would say, you know, back in normal times, district meetings are probably the easiest meetings to have because you are literally in the district. You don't have to travel all the way to Sacramento to have the meeting. And I think members like to meet with their members in the district, you know, because it keeps them connected to the place that they are representing. So I don't think they have, I think that you tend to have more district meetings than Sacramento meetings. The nice thing about the Sacramento meetings is obviously you're meeting not only with the member themselves, but also with their staff people that tend to be more of the policy people working on issues rather than the district staff who tend to be the people working more on district specific issues. So it sort of just depends on what's happening. And then as far as the form of communication, I think that, you know, it's been more tricky trying to get phone calls again because of staffing, the way that staffing is working. So I think written communication, I think tends to be the best the height of the communication is oral, meaning like meeting with the member and having a conversation with them. If you can't do that, writing them via email is probably the next best and fastest way of communication. And so, that would be what I would recommend. But sometimes we've even had folks where we have call-in days where, you know, maybe a bill is on the floor and the member needs to hear rapidly and immediately some kind of communication, yay or nay on something, and then we'll want people to call in, or people should be calling in. But honestly, do whatever works for you, because the point of it is just communicate with your member. That's really the most important thing.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. And I will add, I think that was very thorough and great. And Monica, I know we're running up a lot to the end here, but there's one other question, and I just wanted to make a comment on that question as well. Is, you know, in district, yes, easier because you're already there. You probably won't have to travel very far unless, like Kim and me, you know, we are in the Sacramento area already. And often, not always, but often when you have the member in district, they are just more focused. When they're in the Capitol, they're going from committee hearing to committee hearing, maybe to the floor. They're just all over the place, and they're dealing with as many bills as we are, right, or more, many more. And so they've got it together, but sometimes they're just a little scattered or distracted by all the things going on. So that's an advantage, I think, of in-district meetings, besides the travel and the carbon emissions associated with that. But the advantage of being in Sacramento, when we get back to a more normal time where we can be in Sacramento, you can stop and drop by a whole bunch of legislators. You can stop by your senator and your assembly member and, you know, key committee staff or committee members meetings. So you can, you know, kind of feed two birds with one seed, so to speak. So that's really helpful. And there was a comment that came in about directly liaising with the government and how important that is if the government listens. And I want to assure you that not only do your legislators listen, they want to hear from you, and they are very responsive. You call them, you get a call back. You write them, you will get a written response. So please, it's easy, I think, to feel like, oh, I'll just get written off. It's not worth my time. But as Kim said early in this presentation, your legislators work for you, and they want to represent you. So definitely encourage you to be in touch. And then lastly, there was also another direct message in the chat about how do we act globally and collaboratively towards cohesive protections. And I would say that one recent and current example is the 30 by 30 effort. So, not only is California leading the way as the first state to make that, policy and the goals to achieve 30 by 30 here. That's 30% of our lands and waters protected by 2030. But we're walking the walk. The California Natural Resources Agency is leading the way, and we are doing it. And we have, the Biden administration has also pledged 30 by 30 and working at, and it's really a global understanding that we have to do better to address the biodiversity crisis at this time. So that's one example of where we are working collaboratively and globally. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Monica, for our last pitch.
Thank you. And apologies if we couldn't get to your questions. You are welcome to reach out over email if you have one. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining us all.